That's a thought or intriguing title, huh? James chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. You do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. When was the last time you thought about dying? I know some of you do because some of you have told me that you've been thinking about it. I don't mean to sound morbid this morning, but you do realize, don't you, that you and I could die at any moment? I mean, I could even die before this sermon's over. It's so easy for us to think of today as just another typical day. Because most days we live our lives so consumed with ourselves, whether it's school or work or appointments, family schedules, or those wonderful honey-do lists. I mean, most days we're simply consumed with life. Life happens, whether we want it to or not. The problem with this is we can become so busy with life that very little thought is ever given to our God. On most days, we forget that our lives are simply a vapor, a mist that vanishes. But as we learned last week, there is nothing typical about today. I mean, just think for a moment, everything that has to function properly just for you to survive. For example, your kidneys. The only people who really think about their kidneys are people whose kidneys don't work properly or who only have one kidney. I mean, the majority of us just take our kidneys for granted, along with our lungs, our spleen, our pancreas, our heart. I mean, you name it. All those internal organs that we are so dependent upon just to stay alive. Or what about driving down the road at 60 miles an hour? Highway 30, oh my goodness. And to realize that other people are coming at you at the same rate of speed, and all it would take is somebody to jerk their hand a little bit to get distracted by a phone call or a text message, and you could be dead. I don't think that's morbid. It's reality. That's why it's crazy to think of today as just a typical day to do whatever you want to do, which is why James' words are so appropriate. So I'll repeat them. To those who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, make money, why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a vapor, a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. When we stop to think about those words, it can be a little unsettling, a little unnerving. But do you actually believe that you could vanish from this life at any moment? That this very day could be the last day of your life. Or you, like so many teenagers, you feel kind of invincible, that life will just last indefinitely. Theologian Frederick Buechner has written these thought-provoking words. He said, intellectually, we all know that we'll die. But we do not really know it in the sense that the knowledge becomes a part of us. We do not really know it in the sense of living as though it were true. On the contrary, we tend to live as though our lives would go on forever. When I finished the rough draft of this message on Tuesday, I never would have imagined that we would be burying our dog Tippy on Thursday. He was 13 years old, lived a good long life. We'd had him for 12 and a half years. We rescued him from the pound, if you will. But it reminded me that life is short. I want to ask you a question. And I want you to be honest with me. Are you the kind of person who worries? I mean, raise your hand, be honest. Let's see how many hands will go up. Okay, a lot of you. Thanks for being honest. Are you somebody who gets stressed out over things beyond your control? Okay, a lot of heads nodding. Now, here's the fun part. I know some of you are guilty of this. Do you try to justify your worry and stress because you take things more seriously than most people do? If so, how do you reconcile a perplexing command like Philippians 4:4, which says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. It's an imperative. It's a command. But I want you to notice what it doesn't end with. It doesn't say, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say rejoice, unless you're doing something that's really important or really stressful. It's a command for all of us to follow. And there's another command 2 verses later that says, do not be anxious about anything. Whoa. When you become consumed with your problems and stressed out about life, family, work, you are actually conveying the belief that you think that the circumstances of your life are more important than God's command to always rejoice. In other words, you're saying that you believe that you have a right to disobey God because of the magnitude of your responsibilities. Whoa. I might have stepped on a few toes there. You see, worry implies that we don't think God is big enough or powerful enough or loving enough to take care of what's happening in our lives. Stress says that the things we are involved in are more important or important enough to merit our impatience, our lack of grace toward others, or our tight grip of control. Basically, these two behaviors, worry and stress, communicate that it's okay to sin and not trust God because the stuff in your life is somehow exceptional over everybody else's stuff. Both worry and stress reek of arrogance. They declare our tendency to forget that we have been forgiven, to forget that our lives here are brief, to forget that we are headed to a place where we won't ever be lonely, afraid, or hurt ever again. We forget that in the context of God's strength, all of our problems are small indeed. Why are we so quick to forget God? Why do we think we're so important? I mean, who do we think we are anyway? Our lives are but a vapor. A mist. You know, I find myself, it's like hitting your head against a wall. It doesn't really do a lot of good except give you a headache. And I find myself having to relearn this lesson over and over and over again. Even though I get a glimpse of God's holiness from time to time, I'm still dumb enough to forget that my life is all about God and not all about me. To help you understand and illustrate this point, I want you to imagine for a moment that you are appearing in an upcoming blockbuster movie as an extra. You will probably scrutinize your one scene where hundreds of people are milling around just waiting for that 2/5 of a second when you can see the back of your head. Now maybe your mom or your closest friends might get a little excited about that 2/5 of a second that the back of your head's on the screen. Maybe. But no one will even realize it's you unless you tell them. And they won't really care anyway. But let's take it a step further. Let's suppose on opening night that you rent out the local theater and invite all your friends and family to come and see the new movie all about you. They're probably saying, you're an idiot. How could you possibly think this movie is about you? But here's the thing. For a lot of Christians, we are even more delusional than the person I just described. Because a lot of us think and live as though the movie of life is all about us. Let's consider for a moment the movie of life, shall we? God creates the world. Any of you alive back then? I know some of you are kind of old, but I don't think we were there. Yeah. I mean, was God talking to you and He proclaimed it is good about everything that He had just made? Well, then the people go off and they rebel against God, who, by the way, if you didn't know it already, happens to be the main character in this movie. So God floods the earth to get rid of the mess that the people had made of it. Now, fast forward a bit, several generations later, God singles out a 99-year-old man named Abram and makes him the father of a nation. Did any of you have anything to do with that? Several years later, along comes Joseph, second in command only to Pharaoh, and several hundred years later, Moses comes, and the point is that God just keeps taking these ordinary, inadequate people and uses them for His bidding, and it's obvious that the movie is not about them, but that it's all about God, because God is the one who handpicks them. He directs them. He works the miracles through them. And now in the next scene, God sends judges and prophets to His nation because the people just can't seem to give Him the one thing that He asks of them: obedience. And then comes the climax. The Son of God is born among the people whom God somehow still loves. And while He's in the world, the Son teaches His followers what true love looks like. Then the Son of God is murdered and then resurrected and goes back up to be with God, His Father. And even though the movie isn't quite finished yet, we know what the last scene will hold. It's the scene I described to you last week. The throne room of God, where every being is worshiping God who sits on the throne, for He alone is worthy to be praised. From start to finish, this movie is obviously all about God. He's the main character. So how is it even possible that we can live as though it's about us? Our one puny scene in this movie, our brief lives, fall somewhere between the time Jesus ascended into heaven in Acts chapter 1 and when we will all worship God around His throne in heaven for all eternity in Revelation. All we have is that 2/5 of a second long scene to live. I don't know about you, but I want my 2/5 of a second to be all about making a big deal about God instead of me. 1 Corinthians 10:31 sums it up really well. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. That's what each of our 2/5 of a second lives are all about. So what does that mean for us today, here in Rainier, Oregon? Frankly, it means we need to get over ourselves. Now, that might sound a bit harsh, but seriously, that's what it means. Maybe life is pretty good for you right now. Great! God has given you this good stuff so that you can show the world a person who enjoys blessings while still being totally obsessed with God. Or maybe your life is more on the other end of the spectrum, where things are really rough for you right now, and everything feels like a struggle. God has allowed these difficult times in your life so you can show the world that your God is great and that knowing Him brings you peace and joy, even when life is difficult and hard. Like the psalmist said in Psalm 73, I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Surely in vain have I kept my heart pure. When I tried to understand all this, it was oppressive to me until I entered the sanctuary of God. For the psalmist, it was like the world made absolutely no sense until he stepped into God's presence and everything became clear. I mean, it's so easy to become disillusioned with the circumstances of our lives when we compare them to others. But in the presence of God, He gives us a deeper peace and joy that transcends everything, whether good or bad. To be brutally honest, it doesn't really matter what your situation in life is right now. I saw an illustration of this week that was quite comical. Friday morning, I was out early walking at Heron Point, and the kids were starting to gather around the main playground area there to wait for the bus to pick them up. And there was one little boy, probably the smallest, youngest of the group, who was hanging back. He didn't want to cross the street. And one of his buddies is across the street saying, "No, come on over. You need to come over here so we can get the game started. You know, we need to come over." And the little boy's like, "But it won't be fair." Whatever the game was, I don't know what they were playing, but he was just convinced because he was like the smallest or whatever, and whatever team he got stuck on, it wasn't going to be fair. And the other boy just responds, "I know, but it doesn't matter." I thought, wow, it doesn't really matter what your situation in life is right now. Your only responsibility, your only job, if you will, is to bring God glory in your circumstances, no matter where you are. Whether you're eating a sandwich or on your lunch break or drinking your first cup of coffee in the morning, whether you're sitting in class or watching your child take a nap, the entire point of your life, the reason for your existence, is to point others to Him. Period. Whether you're doing whatever you're doing, God wants to be glorified in it. This entire thing is His, and it's all about Him. It's His movie, His world, His gift to us. So even though God has given us this life, this brief two-fifths of a second scene in His movie, we're still prone to forgetting that we are not the ones in control. Oh, how we wrestle for control. And I've been reminded recently how fragile, how short, how out of control life really is sometimes. Whether it was our dog we had to put down this week, or my dear friends in Ashland grieving over the loss of their 35-year-old son, or dear sweet saint from the church we served in DeSoto, Missouri, grieving the sudden loss of her spouse of 71 years this past week. Life is always fragile, isn't it? It's never really under our control either. Ultimately, I have about as much control over my life and what happens to me as I do my own daughter. Nada. Zilch. I mean, the easy and often the most common thing we do when we're struck with a realization like this is to withdraw and start living in a guarded, safe, controlled way. To stop taking risks and to be ruled by our fears of what might happen. I mean, turning inward is certainly one way to respond. I don't recommend it, but it seems to be the most common thing that we do. But a much better way to respond is to acknowledge our lack of control, to acknowledge our weakness, and then reach out to God for help. I mean, if life were stable and always predictable, we wouldn't need God. We wouldn't need His help. But since it's not, I need to reach out to Him every single day. And I'm learning to be thankful for the unknowns and that I don't have control, because it makes me turn to God more readily. Just to put it into perspective how brief our lives really are, someone has figured out that since the beginning of life on earth, somewhere between 45 and 125 billion people have lived on earth. I don't know how they came up with this, but that's the figures. In about 75 years, give or take a couple of decades, no one will remember you. That's a sobering thought. Everyone you know will be dead. No one will care what job you had, or what car you drove, or what school you attended, or what clothes you wore. This realization can be terrifying or rather reassuring, or a mixture of both. The question that we really need to answer is this: are you ready for what's next? Are you ready? You know, the best example I've ever read concerning about how life vanishes like a vapor is the story of Stan Gerlich. Stan was a successful businessman who was giving a eulogy at a memorial service for a friend. I mean, nowhere is the brevity of life more apparent than at a funeral or memorial service, much like the one we had here yesterday. So Stan decided to share the gospel at this memorial service for his friend. And at the end of his message, Stan told the mourners, he said, "You never know when God is going to take your life." At that moment, there's nothing you can do about it. The question is, are you ready? And with those words still hanging in the air, Stan turned around, went back to his chair on the platform, sat down, where he promptly fell over and died. His wife and sons tried to resuscitate him, but there was nothing they could do, just as Stan had said a few moments before. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33, we read these words. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Now, I can only imagine what it must have felt like for Stan. I mean, think about this for a moment. One minute he's at a memorial service saying to a crowd, this is who Jesus is. And the next moment he was standing before God hearing Jesus say, this is who Stan Gerlich is. I mean, one second he's confessing Jesus, and a second later Jesus was confessing him before his Father. It can happen that quickly. And it could happen to any one of us even today. But the question remains, in the words of Stan Gerlich, are you ready? Are you ready for what's next? In closing this morning, I want to share a story from the book Crazy Love by Francis Chan. Brooke Bronkowski was a beautiful 14-year-old girl who was in love with Jesus. Do we have any 14-year-olds in the room here? Any that are 14? Maybe some that are a little older, maybe some a little younger. When she was in junior high, she started a Bible study on her campus. She spent her babysitting money on Bibles so that she could give them to her unsaved friends. Youth pastors who heard about this brought her boxes of Bibles to give away. When Brooke was about 12 years old, she wrote the following essay, and it will give you an idea of the kind of girl that she was. Since I Have My Life Before Me by Brooke Bronkowski. I'll live my life to the fullest. I'll be happy. I'll brighten up. I will be more joyful than I have ever been. I will be kind to others. I will loosen up. I will tell others about Christ. I will go on adventures and change the world. I will be bold and not change who I really am. I will have no troubles, but instead will help others with their troubles. You see, I'll be one of those people who live to be history makers at a young age. Oh, I'll have moments, good and bad, but I will wipe away the bad and only remember the good. In fact, that's all I remember. Just good moments. Nothing in between. Just living my life to the fullest. I'll be one of those people who go somewhere with a mission, an awesome plan, a world-changing plan, and nothing will hold me back. I'll set an example for others to follow. I will pray for direction. I have my life before me. I will give others the joy I have, and God will give me more joy. I will do everything God tells me to do. I will follow the footsteps of God. I will do my best. Brooke Bronkowski. During her freshman year of high school, on the way to the movies one night, Brooke was killed in a car accident. Her life on earth ended when she was only 14, but her impact did not. Nearly 1,500 people attended Brooke's memorial service. People from her public high school read poems she had written about her love for God. Everyone spoke of her example and her joy. After the gospel message was shared, Francis Chan, officiating this service, invited those who wanted to know this Jesus that Brooke so dearly loved to come forward and give their lives to him. At least 200 students were on their knees in the front of the church praying for salvation that day. Ushers gave a Bible to every one of them. Bibles that Brooke had kept in her garage, hoping to give them to all of her unsaved friends. In one day, Brooke led more people to Christ, to salvation, than most of us will in an entire lifetime. In her brief 14 years on earth, Brooke was faithful to Christ. Her short life was definitely not wasted. The words from her essay seem prophetic. You see, I'll be one of those people who live to be history makers at a young age. You know, we've all been shocked to hear about or watch someone we know pass unexpectedly from this life. It's good to think about those people in your life and to think about death. Sadly, a lot of people die while living selfishly. I've been to a few of those funerals. It's difficult. Their funerals are filled with individuals who tend to stretch the truth in order to create some semblance of a meaningful life. Nobody would dare say an unkind word at their funeral. There seems to be this unspoken obligation to always come up with something nice to say about the person who has just died. But sometimes we're probably thinking in the back of our minds, you know, that person really wasn't that nice of a person. Because the truth of the matter is, a lot of people waste their lives. Now, this is not meant to bash the people who are gone. It's to warn those of us who are still alive. How are you spending your life? I can pretty much guarantee you that at your funeral, it'll be nice. People say a lot of nice things about you, but the fact of the matter is, at that point, you won't care. You'll be dead. A.W. Tozer once said, "A man by his sin may waste himself, which is to waste that which on earth is most like God. This is man's greatest tragedy and God's heaviest grief." Don't waste your life. When we stand before the judgment seat of God, nice isn't what we will be concerned with. And it's definitely not what God will be thinking about. Any compliments that you received on earth will be gone. And the only thing left of you will be the truth. In Revelation chapter 3, in verse 1, the church of Sardis had built up a great reputation. But it didn't matter. Jesus said to them, "I know your deeds. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead." Ultimately, the only thing that really matters in this life is the reality of who you are when you stand before God on Judgment Day. 1 Corinthians 3, 13 through 15 tells us that when you stand before God, your work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. Now, this may sound harsh, but harsh words and loving truth often go hand in hand. I mean, I think it's easy for us to hear a story like Brooks about this courageous young person and then just kind of move on. Because we don't know Brooke. We never knew her. And just forget about it. While not acknowledging the fact that it could just as easily be you or me, my wife or daughter whose life ends suddenly. You could be the next person in your family to die. I could be the next person in our church to die. We have to realize that we have to believe it enough that it changes the way we live today. When a friend was asked if he was spending too much of his time serving and giving too much of his money away, he responded by saying, "I wonder if you'll say that after I'm dead." Friends, we need to stop living selfish lives, forgetful of God. Our lives here are short, often unexpectedly so, and we all need to be reminded of that from time to time. In the movie of life, nothing matters except God. Don't let yourself forget that. Soak it in. Keep remembering that it's true, that He is everything and that it's all about Him. I mean, ponder with me for just a moment that if you were to die today, what would you regret? There's space in your bulletin. If you want to write this question down, give it some more thought, some more careful consideration. If you died today, what would you regret and why? Think about it. If you were to take your last breath this very day, What would you regret? What do you need to change, or what can you change about your life today to avoid those regrets? Don't live with regret. Don't live with worry and stress. Trust in God. Keep leaning into Him. Use everything, and in everything you do, let it be for His glory, to point others to Him. That's our purpose in life. Are you ready for what's next? Let's pray. Father, this week, this message really hit home. Even though it was primarily because of a beloved dog. But it reminded me that life is short. Funeral service that we had here yesterday, one that was at Lynchwood Church of God yesterday, and the former pastor's wife. And Father, we realize that life is short. The many dozens of people killed in the earthquake in Mexico this past week, those that have lost lives in the hurricanes in Texas and Florida, and the many islands that the hurricane hit on its way to Florida. Father, we see the news stories, but because it's so far away, sometimes we forget that our lives are but a vapor, a mist that vanishes in a brief time. And Father, we've been challenged this morning to live our lives for You completely. To make our existence, this brief moment on earth, to be all about You. To point others to You. As we heard Thursday night with the young people, to go all in. 100% committed to You. Forgetting everything else. Keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Father, there may be some people here this morning struggling with parts of their lives that they've just been hanging on to for too long. People who are struggling with worry and stress, not being obedient to rejoice, not being obedient to not be anxious. Oh my goodness. Get in line. We've all been there. But for some, it may be keenly apparent this morning that they've been just worrying a little too much and not trusting You enough. And so in a moment when the praise team comes back up to sing, I just pray that they would have the courage to step out and come and just surrender everything to You. To come to this altar, to just focus on You. To regain that proper perspective of making life all about You instead of us. Thank You. In Jesus' precious name I pray. Amen.